I am here with Dr. John Greco, who is a philosophy professor at Georgetown University. Hi, Dr. Greco.
Hey, Sahar.
Thanks for joining us. So, there's lots of different kinds of beliefs people have, but what is a religious belief?
Well, I mean, one way you can think of religious belief is just a belief that has some kind of religious content. So, for example, that God exists or that God has certain purposes for us, or some such thing as that. A lot of times people talk about belief in God, and I think that philosophers of religion and theologians, they I think there's good consensus that belief in God involves more than just beliefs about God, because typically belief in God would imply some kind of trust in God, or some kind of confidence that God will act in certain ways, some sort of allegiance to God. But but at least part of belief in God would be beliefs about God, or at least most people would think that. And so by religious belief, we mean that more narrow belief component usually. And then we ask things about, where does that, what are the sources of belief? Is that kind of belief rational? That sort of thing.
Great questions. What are the sort of ways that people come to believe things about God?
Uh-huh. Yeah. So, I think that a lot of us uh, have beliefs about God that we inherit from our religious communities or religious traditions. So we're taught things about God, um, maybe in a formal way, maybe more informally. People tell us about their own experience of God. But then that points to another source of belief in God. Maybe you didn't get it from somebody else, but you have an experience of God in your own life. And then, of course, there's a whole uh, more intellectual or scholarly tradition, where you find not just testimony or experience, but also arguments about God's existence. Some people think that you have to posit some kind of divine creator in order to explain certain things, such as maybe the existence of the universe in the first place, or a ground for morality, or something like that. So sometimes you could say that beliefs about God are grounded in those sorts of arguments or more theoretical considerations as well.
So, when we're talking about how someone could come to know God or weaker come to think that they know God, there's all these different sources being told, experience, or arguments. Does the different source mean that we end up with different kinds of religious belief, or does the source not matter? It's going to be called a religious belief regardless.
Well, I think that the way I'm using the term, it would be a religious belief regardless, because I was thinking that a religious belief is just a belief that has some kind of religious content. You could say a belief about God and some, either directly or indirectly, and you could get that kind of belief from uh, various sources.
Okay. So let's talk more about testimony then. So if I got testimony from my mom, then I got testimony from a person, or if I open up the
Yeah.
Bible, I'll get
Hmm.
it from a book. But then there's also revelation. Could you tell me more about how someone can acquire a religious belief from revelation? What is that?
Yeah. So I like how you're putting revelation under the broader category of testimony. So maybe it would make sense just to talk about testimony in
Please
general
do. Please
for a
do.
moment.
Yeah.
So what you might mean by testimony, I think a reasonable way to think of testimony in this context is when someone tells you about something. So it might be, as you said, your mom is telling you that, your dad is going to be late for dinner, or telling you something about your childhood. So so testimony doesn't have to be a kind of formal testimony like on the witness stand in a court, but we use that term more broadly, again, for when someone's telling you something in a way that they want to let you know, or they want to let you know something, or they want to express a belief that they have, and offer it as something that you might want to take on as well. So if we're talking about testimony in that broad context, you could get testimony about God from various places. So, as you said, you could think of scripture and the prophets, um, in the Bible, the Quran, or some other religious text. You could think about a religious teacher telling you about God, and you could think of it in a much more informal sense, like your mom telling you about God in some way or another. So if we're thinking in those broad terms, I suppose you might think of revelation as not just testimony about God, but testimony from God. So the idea is that God speaks to us uh, either through prophet or through scripture, or maybe some kind of direct communication. Obviously, people sometimes feel that they have an experience of God telling them something directly, personally in their own life. So I suppose, if we're thinking of testimony in these broad terms, you can think of revelation as a kind of testimony where the speaker, so to speak, the testifier, is God telling us about himself.
Mm. So let me repeat some of that and make sure I got it down right. When we're thinking about testimony, we should be thinking about this basic mechanism through which someone tells someone something. And in that sense, well, we can learn about God or have beliefs about God from a book or from a person. And there's also God telling us himself about himself, calling that revelation.
I think that's how the three major traditions of the Abrahamic faiths, right? Islam, Judaism, Christianity, they would all have a place for, a central place for revelation, or if you like, God telling us
Mm.
about themselves.
So when your mom tells you that your dad's going to be late for work or something, for you to believe that, you have to trust her. And if you were to read something out of a text, for you to believe that, you have to trust the author of the book.
Mhm.
Where does trust come into revelation, and where does trust come into testimony larger?
Okay, that's a great question, and it's a question that people think about and debate about, right? What is the role of trust when we base our beliefs on testimony, whether it be from another human person, or as we say in Revelation, from God? So, but I think you're right. I mean, I think it does make sense to say that testimony involves trusting the person who's telling you something in one way or another, right? Um, I'm not going to believe what you're telling me unless I trust you
Right.
as someone who is a good source for the information, whatever you're offering me when you're telling me something. So, but where does that trust come from? I think it could come from different places. It might be through interpersonal experience, right? You might come to know a person as trustworthy from your own experience of that person. You could form that trust on the basis of trusting someone else who's saying this is a trustworthy person, right? So testimony from one person can maybe open up a source from another person. Uh, and then I suppose a third source would be I just, putting interpersonal relationship aside, I might just know certain things about you, which just give me good reasons to trust you about, at least the sort of thing that you're talking about. I mean, generally, we don't trust people for, whatever they say on whatever topic. Usually we trust people to tell us the truth in certain more narrow areas, right? So, I'm going to trust my mom about some things, but not others, right? And that would be, it's not about my mom, it's about anyone, right? Um, but in any case, I think trust in God, and therefore an openness to hear or receive testimony from God could come from any of those sources, right? That interpersonal experience, someone else telling us about God and preparing us, for that kind of trust, or again, those more theoretical considerations that put me in a position to think, well, this is something that I should trust or believe. Yeah.
So is it going to be rational to form a religious belief when your religious belief is from an experience that you have? I mean, sure, you might trust your experiences, and if you feel that God is speaking to you and somehow the revelation is telling you something religious, can you trust that? Actually, is it rational to trust it? Is it rational to have a religious belief from revelation?
Yeah, good. So this is the main topic of the area that where I think about these sorts of things most, which is the epistemology of religion, right?
Oh, what's that?
Epistemology.
What is that?
So epistemology in general studies when things are, what makes something reasonable or rational to believe, what makes it the case that we know certain things and don't know others, right? What's the difference between knowledge and mere opinion? Those sorts of questions. So the epistemology of religious belief asks that about, guess what? Religious belief, right? So I think that there are there are certain traditions, there are certain ways of thinking, especially in contemporary context, where it's just assumed that there's a kind of opposition between faith and rationality,
Mm-hmm.
or belief in God and what's reasonable or rational or what's possible to know. But that's more a feature of sort of the contemporary context than most of the Western tradition and other traditions as well, where people think not just that they have beliefs about God, but for one reason or another, those beliefs are reasonable or rational or even constitute knowledge. And so the epistemology of religion would investigate what are the conditions under which that would be the case, because obviously not all beliefs about God are reasonable or rational or constitute knowledge, right? I mean, you can have just crazy beliefs, but is it possible that other beliefs would have that kind of good epistemic standing or good rational standing? And that's what the epistemology of religion looks at and debates about.
So, what's a theory that's either your own or in the field on
Mhm.
what makes a religious belief
Mhm.
a rational
Mhm.
belief?
So let me give you a bad theory first.
Okay.
Okay. So a bad theory, a very popular theory, but in my opinion, not a very good one, is that the only way that you could have reasonable beliefs in God would be through some kind of argument or evidence that is going to be independently verifiable and persuasive to any reasonable person. Okay. Now, the reason I think that's a bad theory is because we know almost nothing like that. So why think that that's the only way you could know God or the only way you could have reasonable beliefs about God? So just take, for example, our knowledge of other human persons. How is it that you know your parents or your friends, or for that matter, any other people that you have a less intimate relationship
Not
with?
through an
How do you know that?
argument.
Not through arguments, not through it, right? And in fact, there's a whole history of philosophy, in philosophy, where people tried to argue for the existence of other minds, which is really, arguing for the existence of other persons. How is it that I know that there are other persons? The assumption being, well, I have to have a good argument, I have to have good evidence. And that has to be independent of any of my beliefs about persons in the first place. That's a kind of failed project in the history of philosophy. So another failed project. How do I know anything about the world outside my own mind? Again, if you think it's got to be some kind of argument or reasoning that's independent of any such knowledge, so that I somehow can reason independently from sort of my own experience or ideas to the outside world, again, failed project. So why accept that project for understanding the reasonableness or rationality of religious belief? I think that a better Sorry if I'm talking too much
No, let me
at
jump in
once
and make
here.
sure I
Yeah.
understand you correctly.
Okay. Yeah.
When I ask, how do you know,
Yeah.
or well, how about that's probably the wrong word, but how do you argue that a religious belief is a rational belief? One answer some people give is that it has to be through arguments, and you're arguing, no, it doesn't have to be through arguments. But before you tell us how religious beliefs are reasonable, do you think that you can't come to know God through arguments, or are you just saying that's not the only way?
Yeah. No, that's great. That's a nice clarification. So we're talking about not just arguments, but particular kinds of arguments that have a certain kind of quality to them, meet certain standards, right? And again, in many traditions, including Islam, Christianity, Judaism, people have thought that there are such arguments. So such arguments are possible to establish God's existence. But I think it's also a good consensus that even if there are, that's not how most people base their belief in God, right? Because most people are not philosophers. Most people are not studying, the cosmological argument or the teleological argument or some other argument that philosophers study that some think prove that God exists, others think don't. But so I think that if we were asking, well, what makes my belief as just an ordinary person, what makes my belief reasonable if it is? Then I think it would probably be more realistic to look at experience or testimony or some combination of experience and testimony and some arguments in the background, perhaps. That seems to me to be a more plausible approach, and one that has some chance of being successful if you're trying to explain how religious belief might indeed be reasonable or rational or even constitute a kind of knowledge of God. Yeah.
Dr. John Greco, thanks so much.